to start out by understanding their frame of reference has to be part of anything where you want a movement in their behavior, their attitude, their way of seeing the world. If you want to have them engage in a new initiative or different way of doing things, you've got to understand how they're viewing it as a starting point before you try and bring them into your frame of reference.
Welcome to Your Intended Message, the perfect place for leaders and promising professionals who want to convey the intended message for greater success. Every week, we interview experts who address the challenges and best practices to deliver your message effectively. That might be one-to-one, one-to-few, or one-to-many. And perhaps the most important conversation, one-to-self. I'm your host, George Torok. My guest today is Mitch Fairrais. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about him. 1, he works with senior leadership teams of some of the largest corporations around the globe, and he's an expert in leadership development and communication. Leaders need to communicate better. 2, he holds a high level of skepticism about many aspects of conventional corporate wisdom. Yes, there's a lot of myths out there that people are following blindly, and Mitch is here to help set them straight. And 3, there's something a little different. He's one of the founders of Socks for Souls Canada. It's a nonprofit, primarily volunteer-run organization committed to providing unhoused people with warmth, comfort, dignity, mobility, and health through new socks. Funny how something as simple as warm socks can be, especially in the winter. And since its inception, Socks for Souls Canada has put over 1 million pairs of new socks on the feet of the homeless community in the Greater Toronto area and across Ontario. A bold and brave venture. Mitch Fairrais, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here with you.
Delighted, Mitch, to be talking with you today, and I'm glad you have the time for us. And we're going to take a look at some of those myths around corporate communication, leadership communication. And you have said before that one of the challenges is that our audience doesn't always see the picture the same way that we do. And that's a challenge, certainly for leaders. First of all, why does that exist? Why is there that breakdown?
I think it's simple. You and I and every leader on the planet lives with some level of being very much caught in their own frame of reference. Our own upbringing, our own algorithms that have caused us success, how we've dealt with things, our own beliefs, our own values. There are a number of things that each of us comes to any circumstance with and any interaction with. And it's our frame of reference that we cling to because it's all we know. And it's very difficult for most human beings to actually step into the frame of reference of others, which, if you ask me, is the single most important skill that any leader could possess. Beyond basic language skills or some math skills, some basic skills like that, the next really important skill is the ability to step into someone else's frame of reference and deal with them, ideally, completely from in their frame of reference, as opposed to my own when I'm dealing with other human beings.
And Mitch, I can see the challenge because we invest a lot of time in developing ourselves. We study, we might read books, we go to seminars, webinars, we learn, we try to learn from the mistakes we made, and therefore we think we are, what we know is valuable, and that's why we are in this position of leadership, because we have all this knowledge and experience and perspective, and therefore we must be right.
Listen, I've never met any leader who doesn't believe they're other than right. Like, it would be a very strange thing to think that you're not right. And of course, most of us are so focused on helping others get it right, that we fail to recognize that we don't always have the whole picture. And so often leaders will try and make it a monologue rather than a dialogue. And for people to make any movement, even if the leader is absolutely correct, for a leader to get any movement out of people that they are leading, they have to encourage others to be part of the dialogue, part of the conversation. And if they can't have that party or parties that they're trying to deal with understood, having a voice, their ability to move them from point A to point B, whether it's attitudinally, beliefs, or actions, is going to be very, very difficult.
Mitch, can you give us an example of how that conversation should look?
Yeah, it's really simple. In most cases, it means that if I'm starting a conversation with you, George, my desire is to understand how you see the world, how you view things, how you believe things should be. And in addition to that, if I'm really good, I'm dialed into, I wonder how George's emotions are today. What's he dealing with? What's he up against in the background? And what I'm not trying to do is bring my reality into your world, but I'm trying to understand your reality first so that I can ideally bring you then into my reality. So it's really about who goes first in terms of understanding the other party's frame of reference. And most leaders are happy to start to talk about what should occur, how things should be, what they expect of, without first getting a clear baseline on where that other human being stands on any given issue or anything they're being asked to do. So I think, it's a simple matter of first step, always getting to the other person's frame of reference.
And the phrase, I know how you feel.
Well, you hear my response. Absolutely not. Yeah, anyone who says to me, I know how you feel. If I am 1,000 human beings out of 1,000 human beings being polled, I'm saying, I doubt it. I don't think you do. And for anyone to even suggest that they get how someone else views the world is almost ludicrous, because our frames of reference are so different that odds are, if I'm wise, I should go in assuming that your frame of reference is going to be wildly different than mine, because you've grown up differently, maybe have come from a different family background, maybe different part of the world than I, many different things. And I should assume, as a starting point, I have no idea what your frame of reference is, unless we've got lots of history. Even then, I want to, on any given circumstance, on any given issue, explore what your views are, how you feel about, how you're looking at anything that we are talking about in any given moment, even if I've known you for the last 20 years, George.
Let's assume a team leader's in a meeting, running a meeting with the team, and perhaps it's the weekly or monthly meeting where they're simply keeping track of all the projects, where everything's at. And leader is not satisfied with progress. Things aren't moving quick enough, and there seem to be too many mistakes, and there's cost overruns. How can a leader convey their concern without stepping all over the frame of reference of the people in the room?
So a couple of things. Number one is, I'd say the question why is probably the biggest question they can use. So if I have cost overruns or I've seen a bunch of mistakes, if I assume that this team is generally competent, I'm going to say, guys, I don't get it. I don't understand. Why is it that we've had this many missteps on this? I need your help in getting a clear picture of what the reality is for you. And now notice, I'm not talking about the problem itself. I'm looking for their reality, what it's like for them, because they're going to say, well, actually, you don't see that what I'm up against is I have to run this through 4 other departments before I can make a move, or whatever the parties who are feeling hampered or not getting the success they like, are saying is at issue. So, what I'm looking for is not, hey, we need to get a different result. I'm looking for, what's at the root of this? What's causing you grief that has us missing these opportunities or not landing where we should on these particular issues? So I'm really immediately going into trying to understand their frame of reference. It doesn't hurt to put a flag in the stand where you would like things to be, but immediately after that, you want to understand what's preventing you from getting there, as opposed to demanding some sort of action or some sort of change to get there that comes out of the leader's playbook. I am always looking for what can I do to get something they are willing to do, happy to do out of their playbook as opposed to mine. I am more likely to get progress getting from point A to point B if I let them decide what the route from point A to point B will be, as opposed to saying, hey, I've done this for 20 years. I know that the best way, while that isn't going to build buy-in, I'm going to, even if I'm dealing with a fairly young team or new to their circumstances team, I am first going to find out what they believe the right path to success may be, given the challenges we're experiencing, before I'm going to put any suggestions on the table. And if I have a belief around what it should be, I'm going to exhaust their options. And then I'm going to say, hey, here's another option or two. And how would you like to approach this? So now your option is in the mix, but their voice has been heard. And now you give them the option to select amongst, and they might choose what you put on the table. But if you put yours on the table without asking about what they would like to do, odds are they might not choose yours. So give them a suite of options, make the first options on the table theirs.
I'm guessing that threats don't work anymore.
They do, unfortunately, but they don't win anything much more than the short-term gain. So you can threaten people and say, if this doesn't happen by so-and-so, there'll be this consequence or that consequence. And that can be effective, but it better be in crises that you're doing that where there's no other option, because you will get compliance for the short term and maybe achieve whatever goal is in front of you. But getting that team or those individuals to buy in with you going forward, George, I can't even imagine the work that you'd have to do to regain their trust, regain the sense that they feel like a real partner with you before you can get things done with them and through them. Because most of us, George, as you know, get things done with and through others. I can't tell you that there'd be any circumstance where I wouldn't want their voice in the mix so they feel part of this team and they are partners in whatever endeavor we're chasing.
And so when we're asking our team, and what I noticed there is that you started that conversation with, I don't get it. So instead of saying, well, I know with all my experience, I know the answer, I'll tell you how to do it. It's, yeah. I don't get it. Help me out. And so that now makes the leader honor the team by respecting their perspective.
It does. It does, George. And the interesting thing, when I think about one of my intended messages, it is literally around leadership vulnerability. Many leaders believe they have to show strength under all circumstances. And if I truly don't know, I don't understand why we've not got there, I don't want to pretend that I've got insight out of simply being a leader for many years or out of a depth of experience or some familiarity with this subject matter, but rather I'm going to say, hey, I don't get it, guys. I don't see how we're missing this. Help me understand. And it's more about help me. It's more a collaborative. Let's figure this out. It's more exploration than direction. So, I would love to see leaders more vulnerable. I'd like to see more exploration when they don't understand why things have turned out the way they do, rather than having judgment. What I can tell you for sure is you cannot be in anyone's frame of reference and have judgment at the same time. If you're judging someone, you are not in their frame of reference. The only way to be in their frame of reference is to be exploratory in nature.
That's a valuable phrase to remember. If you're judging someone, you're not in there understanding their frame of reference. You're outside and you're saying, well, I'm better than you. That's why I'm judging you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you hear people all the time say, hey, don't judge. And I personally don't know how not to judge. I'm a living, breathing, judging machine. I judge everything and everybody in my path. I can't help it. I'm a human being. What I've learned, however, is to slow my judgment. And I look for much more evidence before I land on a conclusion or a belief about something or someone. So I am often having snap judgments in my head and saying, let's slow down. Let's evaluate. Let's take a look at all the factors. Let's understand how others view it. And to my great, sometimes surprise, there's a whole other side of the story that I couldn't imagine. And so that ability to really look at it with that frame of mind is a lovely way to go about it.
Mitch, let's take a possible challenge for a leader, and it might be that certainly these days where people got used to the idea that they could work from home.
Right.
And now the leader who's our age, who remembers how we used to do things, we show up every day and wants everybody there every day. How does a leader best deal with that situation in a positive framework?
So there's two potential answers to this. And it's funny because I'm trying to think if it was last year or late in the year before, I had that exact circumstance. And I was working with a privately held company, and the head of the company was, after COVID had been behind us and everyone had been working remotely, demanded that everyone be back in the office. And this was an old school leader, let's face it. And inside of that demand, amongst other things, I got called in to say, hey, there's a disconnect here between what leadership is asking and what the folks inside the organizations want to do. And it's impacting two things. The first one is morale. It's dipping like mad. The other is retention. We're losing people we don't want to, and we think there are more poised to go out the door. And I went, okay, let's get in there. We had a bunch of conversations. The first thing, which is not the intuitive place to go, is the leader. If he or she wants to have ongoing success, might not be, this is the way, not so insistent that there is only one solution. There might be hybrids that they would not personally be comfortable with, but if you don't make a move to how people see the world these days, you will quickly be branded as the dinosaur. Whether you own the company or not, people will acquiesce to your conclusions, but they'll still be drawing their own conclusions. Or the other thing is, if you absolutely, as a leader, believe that they all must be back in person without exception, then you've got to start in their frame of reference and help them understand that you recognize the sacrifice that you're asking them to make. And in this case, it was simple issues. People were accustomed to not driving 45 minutes back and forth. People were accustomed to having their kids home from school and being there for them, between Zoom calls, being able to go and make the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. They were accustomed to be able to, at 3:30 in the afternoon, instead of going to have a coffee break, going to put laundry in. They were accustomed to a bunch of things that made their life much easier, and simple things like, man, I saved a lot of money in gas by not going in. So if the leader wants them back, the leader can't do what, in this particular case, the leader did, which is offer all the benefits of being back in the office and what it does for camaraderie and what it does for the culture and how much better we work. And I go, okay, you've got one side of the coin, your side of the coin, your frame of reference, not theirs, because their frame of the reference includes, it's just costing me more money. I can't see my kids. I can't get this done during the day. I now would have to get in the car and drive 45 minutes. All that stuff has to be acknowledged. So the leader shouldn't be starting with, here are the benefits. It should be, I have a huge request of you. I know it's going to be painful on these fronts. And what I don't want is a leader being perceived as oblivious to all the things that the staff and the employees are going to be dealing with. Rather, I'd love the case where the people go, well, he gets it. He knows what we've had that's been better for us. He knows what he's asking us to give up, or she knows what we've been asked to give up. And they are still asking us to make this sacrifice, because it's a very different story than I'm just being told to, I need to be back in the office.
Ultimatums. They don't work anymore either, eh?
Not very well.
Gee, a lot's changed since we worked in the corporate world.
Indeed. If I think about the leader knows best, there's an authority on the premises, there is someone who leads the charge, and from the front, not necessarily from behind. Many of those mindsets have been debunked, and there are better ways. And it's interesting for me because, I talk about leadership vulnerability. You've heard me say that's one of my intended messages. And I'll tell you that leaders showing up as human beings who are willing to explore things with you, as being true partners with you, if you happen to be in their employ, is much more palatable for most people than someone who says, hey, this is the way we're going, and leads the charge. People will often go so far for someone who leads the charge, sets direction, demands things of their people, offers ultimatums. But for those they feel are in it with them and looking to do things in a way that serves the best interests of the human beings involved, often those people will go through walls for their leader that they can't, the leaders will not get that kind of intense effort from their people if they simply think they can lead the charge from the front.
Mitch, what kind of advice do you give to an old school leader who has perhaps the biggest challenge to understand the world today? It's not the way it used to be. What advice do you have to them to get their mindset in the right place when they start these conversations?
George, it's interesting. One of the things is very simply how we started out talking about frame of reference. And the first thing I'll offer any leader is, if I've listened to them interact with their people, and I will say, it's clear to me that you operate out of your frame of reference and you have a number of shoulds. It should be like this. It should be. And I'm going to tell you that those shoulds don't match up with how your people see the world. And for you to be effective or continue to be effective, you're going to have to do some work to get to their frame of reference. I'm not asking you to abandon your frame of reference. I'm not asking you to see the world differently. I am asking you to weigh how the others around you that you want to get work done with and through see the world, because you can't be effective. And if I use the standard terminology that I often use, moving people from point A to point B, if you don't understand what point A is, if all you understand is your frame of reference and where they should be, and you don't understand how they see the world currently and where they're starting, I don't know how you get someone from point A to point B if you don't know where point A is. So for you to be effective, you're going to need to do some work that may not be comfortable, may not be intuitive for you, but to start out by understanding their frame of reference has to be part of anything where you want a movement in their behavior, their attitude, their way of seeing the world. If you want to have them engage in a new initiative or different way of doing things, you've got to understand how they're viewing it as a starting point before you try and bring them into your frame of reference.
Mitch, what can a leader say to demonstrate to their people that they are trying to understand them and that they are having difficulty with that and they might not fully see it that way? What can they say to demonstrate that they actually are serious and they're struggling with this?
Two things. One is any issue that they're dealing with or any circumstance or any endeavor, I'm going to start out with the words, I'm going to share with you how it appears to me. And then I'm going to follow with, I want to understand how it appears to you. And that right away signals a dialogue. It signals that there'll be room for another voice and not just the voice of the leader. Now, the only catch with that, George, is when the leader utters the words, and I want to understand how it appears to you, they've got to mean it. And it means that that should be followed by a number of questions or explorations so that they are demonstrating they're really trying to get the other's frame of reference. They can say, hey, listen, I'm going to hear you out fully. And then, of course, I'm going to make a decision. You know, it might go in ways that aren't comfortable or aren't the way that you would most like. But before I make any decisions, I want to hear you out fully on how you think things should be, how we should tackle this, how we work together to get to this outcome. So I would always begin with words that are something like, I want to share how it appears to me, and I want to understand how it appears to you. And then there's something that's just not anything other than the obvious. Sometimes you speak to the reality, go, listen, I have a completely generation. I might not have my finger on the pulse of everything that you think and understand or everything you see being from a very different generation. I hope you have some grace for me because I'd really like to get to a good way of working together. And, you know, I'll ask for your indulgence. I'll ask for your grace. So literally acknowledging, hey, I am of a different generation. And I know that some things are going to seem odd to you. So put that on the table. It never hurts to acknowledge what should be the obvious, because most people will say, this one's a dinosaur, and they don't even know it. I'd rather be the dinosaur who's self-aware than the dinosaur who's not self-aware.
A dinosaur that's self-aware. That's powerful.
And you can ask for indulgence. You can ask for some grace. You can ask for people to understand that you are going to see it differently. And believe it or not, when you ask for grace and acknowledge who you are, people often give you that grace, surprisingly. They go, yeah, he's of a different generation, or she's of a different generation. Of course, they're going to see it differently. And you earn a little bit of slack in the relationship that will probably serve you going forward.
Mitch, can you tell us a time that perhaps you struggled with understanding a different framework, a different perspective?
For sure. So I grew up in an era where if you wanted to speak to someone, you literally dialed the phone and spoke to them. And you can tell by the way I'm holding the phone what generation I'm not doing this, right? So my intuitive gesture is this. There was a point, and I'm going to say, George, this might have been 20 years ago, where I was talking to very young employees in an organization. And they said something that I was internally trying not to rail against. And they said, my leader, this is 20 years ago, mind you, my leader has the gall to call me. And what they were saying is, they're not sending me a message. They're not emailing. They're actually calling me while I'm at my desk working. And these young employees were very perturbed, but the leaders would have the gall to call them and interrupt their workflow. And I inside went, of course your leaders are going to call you, internally. And I had to take a deep breath and think about it for a bit. And it took me a matter of weeks before I understood the world was changing in a way. And now you and I seldom just pick up the phone and call someone. We send an email, we send a text, we say, would you have some time this afternoon? Would it be okay to talk next Wednesday? And we never, I don't say never, but very seldom do we now think about picking up the phone without prefacing it with some other communication asking if the time is convenient. They knew that 20 years ago. I did not. So, in that case, I was on the verge of becoming the dinosaur, and I had to think hard about my immediate, I was a little bit repulsed. I'm going, how could they think like that? How could they be so callous to their leaders? And of course, the world has turned in that direction. And the guy who needed to learn a lesson was me, not them.
Yes. And I can identify with that. And it's funny. I was working in my office yesterday, just checking up on email, and the phone rang, and I answered it. And the person was surprised that I answered the phone.
That makes perfect sense. The other one that is of more recent vintage, and it too is changing, but I still see leaders struggle, is I watch leaders insist on no devices in meetings. And I know that there is a generation that literally came out of the birth canal holding on to their device. And I know that even I, in meetings, use my devices to take notes. I listen better by capturing certain things. And I am of the mind that I certainly in meetings never ask anyone to turn off or put away their devices. I do know I will lose half the room in that moment because they'll think this guy doesn't get that this is part of what I need to do. I do recognize that the devices get used inappropriately when the devices are left on. There's going to be some portion of the room was going to use them inappropriately, but I might as well acquiesce to the future rather than clinging dearly to the past, because it's just a matter of time where every leader recognizes prying the devices out of their hands is a losing battle. Now, there may be some exceptions. There are some meetings where I do think it's appropriate to say, hey, this one is device free. But for the most part, you're fighting against a tide that's stronger than you are if you're the leader in every meeting that says no devices, the devices go off. I'm a fan of being fully present to the moment and not having devices involved. But if they serve a purpose, I'm not going to try and keep them out of the room out of my fear alone of what might become of that. Surprisingly, for the last 15 years, I've never been in a session. I'm often in front of large audiences. I've never asked for people to turn off their devices, and I've never had any significant challenges because of that.
And I recall a webinar that I delivered some time ago, and just for fun, we did a quick poll asking people how many apps they had open on their computer at the time. And at least 30% had at least 7 apps, and at least 50% had at least 3 apps open. They just got all these other applications open.
Yeah, it makes sense to me this day and age. Wow.
Mitch, for people who might be interested to learn more about your services, how can you help leaders? In what way, and where do they find out more?
Well, there's a bunch of things that I do, and one of them is I do a bunch of individual coaching of executives, but I'm also finding myself in front of leadership audiences. And when I see leadership audiences, I'm often talking to the president or a CEO in their immediate reports, and not often that'll be 6 to as many as 11 people. And I do some spectacular things because I've got some tremendous process for leadership teams to find themselves on the same page with one another, first and foremost, because as you gather any group of adults together, 6 to 11 people, odds are it'll be difficult for them to get on the same page. And I have tremendous process there. But most of them are struggling to build buy-in within their organization for a variety of endeavors where they want new endeavors, they want things handled differently. And I've got some great tools to help them gain influence to be able to get more of their organizations to buy in with greater ease and without the kind of digging in the heels that most leaders experience. Now, that's not only at the president and CEO level. I obviously work at all levels of the organizations. Just happens to be a bunch of my work gets done there. So that's one of the things that I offer. The other couple things are very straightforward. One is I do a lot of work in what I call the realm of influence. And if you and I were to talk about, we just simply talk about it, the ability to deal with others from inside their frame of reference. That's the skill set. The other thing I do a great deal with is what I'll call what's possible thinking. How do you get people to accomplish more than they ever dreamed was possible without grinding them up, without harder work, longer hours? Beyond that, I do a bunch of team building. And of course, I do a bunch of things around leadership development with groups. So those would be the big things. And the simplest way to get in touch with me is, through my email, mitch@onthemark.ca.
And you can find that link in the description below. Mitch, as we prepare to wrap up, if you could sit with a leader and help them get their mind around this understanding the framework of others, and if there was an exercise or thought process that perhaps they should go through on a regular basis, what might that be? What might that advice you'd give them so that they can do it more readily?
Yeah. So the advice I would give most leaders would come in the context of any conversation they're about to have that they perceive as difficult or might be difficult, where they have to ask for something of someone that won't be comfortable, or they have to deliver news that won't be welcomed by the other party, where the stakes are high. And by stakes high, I mean, maybe it involves compensation, maybe it involves their jobs, maybe there'll be emotions at play. It could be any number of things where stakes are very high. And I would ask them always to think about that conversation in the context of that other party and what they're up against. Because what I'm looking for in those moments is not just how can I be good as a leader. And most leaders think about that when they know it's high stakes or it's going to be a vulnerable situation for the other party. They're worried about how they're going to come off. They're worried about what they're going to say. How will they be seen? And I'm going, okay, you've got one half of the worries correct. The other half, and this is what I asked it, the specific ask, how do you bring out the best version of the other person across from you in this conversation? What do I need to consider so that I'm bringing the biggest version of that other person to the table? Most often when we prepare for the most difficult and most challenging conversations, we think about what do I need to be good? And I equally giving focus to what do I need to do with and for the other person to allow them to be at their best.
Valuable advice. My guest today is Mitch Fairrais, reminding you that if you want to take your team from A to B, you first need to understand where the A is.
Listen to your intended message. In this interview, we talked about frame of reference and why it's important for leaders to be able to get into the frame of reference of others if they want to be successful. I'm Mitch Fairrais, and I work with leaders across the globe.
If you like what you heard, tell your friends and post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.